Hi, it's Dr. D, and in this video I'm going to share with you some of the ways in which people settle in relationships, and more specifically 8 ways in which people settle in relationships. My experience has been that most of us at one point or another in our life, we have done some of these things. And unfortunately, when I read this blog again that I had written and was going to do this video, I read over those ways in which people settle, and I thought, gosh, I could check all those boxes. That was a long time ago for sure. And so for me to get out of that, I had to take my own inventory, get real with myself, ask myself some questions, answer them, and make some significant changes in my life. And like I said, that was many years ago, and I'm in a different place. But when people come to me and they share that, they are settling, I really, truly get it. And so I want to help people get to a place where they don't settle in relationships anymore. So let's begin. 8 ways, and one of the first ways in which people have a tendency to settle in a relationship is they relinquish their values. The values are the bedrock of who we are and what we believe in, but somewhere along the line, we say, well, I'm going to push those aside, whether that be trust or honesty or respect or, family or, friends. It could be any of those things, any of those values in our life that we really hold dear to our heart. For whatever reason, we get to a place where we relinquish them, we give them up. And so we settle because, well, this person isn't like this, I'm just going to kind of go along with it because of these other reasons. Or, he or she doesn't believe this way, but I'm just going to ignore that and relinquish what's important to me and go with that person. So relinquishing our values is one of the things that people do in settled relationships, which, is something that really needs to change. Another thing that people do when they settle is that they ignore the red flags. And certainly we're all guilty of that. I was guilty of that. Sometimes, the flags are yellow. Those can be the cautionary flags, but the red flags are kind of blatant. They're right in front of you. And people that settle will just say, oh, there's that red flag, and kind of push it off to the side and go on. And so we know these red flags, but for whatever reason, we have a tendency to ignore them, which coincides with another way in which people settle is that they justify a person's behaviors, which I find can really go hand in hand or be somewhat related. So they're justifying their behaviors, and they could also be the red flags of the relationship. So together, they're doing both these things. So they see the red flags, they're like, oh, that's a red flag. I really should be ignoring that, but I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do instead, I'm going to justify that person's behavior for doing something. And then they justify this little one, and then the little ones add up to the big ones, and then the big ones become whatever they are, and we find ourselves justifying all these things, saying things to our family and friends. Well, he was this way, he was tired, she was tired, this is really what happened, they had a bad day at work, all of these things. But somewhere in a portal of our brain, we know better that we are justifying their behaviors. Another way in which we settle in relationships is we hope that they change. I often say sometimes, where there's love, there's hope, but I'm starting to really rethink that. Sure, when there's love, there's hope, but then we're hoping for what? We're hoping that they change in what ways? Sure, we move into a relationship, we get into a relationship, and maybe we have to make a little adjustments here and there, but to really overhaul these things that we know blatantly that they really should change, we just hope that, gosh, if they just change, then I would be able to stay with them, and if they just do this differently, I would be able to stay with them. So we hope and hope and hope because we really feel this love for them, and we feel these strong feelings that we hope that they'll change. Keep our fingers crossed, our toes crossed. We're doing all of these things in hopes that they are going to change. But the more that we do that, the more we find ourselves in these relationships for a longer period of time, and we continue to settle. Another way that we settle in relationships, we tend to do all the heavy lifting. And what I mean by heavy lifting is, I think that in healthy relationships, there's times where one person will pick up more of the slack than the other person for whatever reason. Work demands, it could be anything. Sickness, could be anything, right? But heavy lifting means that we are doing most of the work. We are the ones carrying the relationship. We are the ones planning things, doing things, carrying the emotional baggage, managing their emotions, managing our emotions, doing a lot of the heavy lifting in these relationships. And we know when we're doing that because we talk about that. I'm always the one that's doing all these things, and how come they're not doing this, or how come they're not doing that, or I feel like I'm the one that carries most of the burden, that I'm doing most of the work, physical, emotional, psychological, and mental. And we know this because we feel this. We feel that we're doing the heavy lifting, and many times if we go to the other person and we share with them, this is how you feel, if we're settling, they're probably not really going to listen to that. They're going to justify that, and they're going to say things like, oh, I'm doing all these different things, or that's not true, and invalidate and so forth. And then if we continue to do that, once again, we go back to justifying their behaviors and justifying why they're not doing something and why they're not showing up. And so doing the heavy lifting is another way in which we settle in the relationships. Another way in which we settle in relationships is that we are fearful of being alone. And so we're thinking, God, well, I'd rather be with somebody than nobody. And you're like, really? So the goal really is to make the decision about whether you want to stay or not for the right reasons, not the wrong reasons. The wrong reasons are, I'm not going to be coupled up anymore. I don't want to be alone. I'm afraid to be alone. What are people going to say to me? That type of thing. Where the truth is that you have to moved through your fear of being alone. And one of the ways in which to do that is to find time in your life to be not in a relationship and to actually be alone. Being alone creates a great feeling of feeling empowered and strength and self-respect, and it helps us to be our own individual. And the more that we work on being ourselves, and the more that and when we're spending time with ourselves and learn all these things about ourselves and being happy with ourselves, the happier we will be with another person, and we will undoubtedly be less inclined to settle, because we've been by ourselves and we know we don't want to do that. And so we are okay being alone. We'd rather have that than being in an unhealthy relationship. But if you don't work through your fear of being alone, you will settle because you're fearful of being by yourself. Another way in which we settle is that we think about what it will feel like to end that relationship and start over again. And what people think is, oh God, I mean, I'm just exhausted at the thought of it. I'm just like starting over again. But I say, really? So you're going to stay in an unhealthy place because you're too tired or you're exhausted even at the thought of starting over again, even though there will be probably, most likely and undoubtedly, a healthier person on the other side of that. And so when we bind this narrative that, you know, I'm going to be so tired, I'm exhausted, the thought of starting over again, I have to go back in the dating scene, and I got to have all these dates, and I got to do all this stuff. You're like, yeah, but you're not in a healthy relationship, and you're settling in all these different ways that aren't even good for you. And so here you are saying, oh, I don't want to do the work. It's like, well, you got to do the work, because if you don't do the work, then you're going to end up in this relationship where you're settling, and then eventually this one may end. And if you don't do the work, then you'll most likely end up in another relationship where you settle again. And so there is the pattern. So you have to be able to step away, change the narrative, and say, I want to be okay being alone. I don't want to be exhausted by the thought or the prospect of having to find somebody new, because on the other side of that is someone who's going to be healthier for me, because I'm going to take the steps to be healthier for myself. Which leads me into the last thing about how we settle in relationships, is we lack self-importance. I mean, if we're not important to ourselves, we don't have self-respect, then how are we going to pick somebody that's really going to be good for us? I mean, if we're not number one on the totem pole, if we're not number one in our world, and we don't have self-respect and set healthy boundaries, and we don't feel like we're important, then how would you think you're going to find someone who's important for you or is going to be healthy for you? Because if we don't feel self-importance, or I'm a really good person, I bring these things to the table, I have self-respect, and I have these values and all these things about me that are important, then we will find ourselves settling. We'll ignore the flags, we'll ignore certain things that are hiding in plain sight. We will do all those things, right? We'll justify behaviors. We won't listen to family friends who have a different observation of this person, because we feel like, well, maybe he's good enough, maybe she's good enough. It's like, really? I mean, someone can be good enough, but if they're unhealthy, if they're an unhealthy person, or they're not good for you, and you know that, it's like, well, then find a way to extricate yourself out of that. And so the work is identifying these things. How many things can you check off? How much work you're willing to do, because you really have to do the work. You take the relationship inventory. You figure out what your triggers are. You ask and answer the questions. Why am I showing up this way? Why am I willing to forsake all these things that are important to me? Why am I willing to ignore those behaviors? What's coming up for me? Where does that come from? Sure, lots of questions, but there's lots of answers. When you start to ask and answer those questions, you will get to another place, and you will find yourself not settling anymore. But like I said, you got to do the work. And you do the work at the front end, right? Take a deep breath, you step away from the relationship, you start doing the work at the front end, because at the back end, there's someone who is healthier for you, because you have become a healthier person for yourself. And I hope that helps.